Flaxborough's annual flower show was the sort of event that could lull a town into complacency and make it feel entirely timeless. The same familiar faces gathered beneath the faded canvas marquee, offering polite nods and an abundance of self-important commentary on begonias and dahlias, as if these flowers held the fate of the nation in their petals. The marquee buzzed with gentle rivalry, Mr. Hargreaves, from the hardware shop, boasting his prize-winning roses, while Mrs. Tilling, chair of the Horticultural Society, looked on with an air of disapproving indulgence. Nearby, Mr. Bexley, recently retired from the town council and still searching for a cause, speculated on the declining quality of the tea, a subject that seemed to unite everyone in muted complaint. Inspector Purbright had arrived late, summoned by an errant message from Sergeant Hobbs, who was already on scene. The inspector's first impression was that the disturbance was entirely incongruous with the floral tranquility. A faint murmuring crowd had gathered near the refreshment stall, whispering and casting sidelong glances at a figure lying motionless on the ground. The victim was a young woman, no more than 20, dressed in the unmistakable bright reds and lace that seemed more appropriate for a seaside resort's holiday promenade than the genteel, if somewhat aging, flower show. Mrs. Tilling whispered to a neighbour, "How dreadful to have such a scandal in our midst. One hardly expects to see anything but posies and polite applause here." Mr. Bexley nodded vigorously, adding, "One wonders what business a girl dressed like that has at a flower show. Not that it's any of my concern, of course." Purbright knelt beside the girl and noted the faint trace of an expensive scent, a hint of violet, and a delicate but unnatural stillness. "Sergeant Hobbs?" Purbright said quietly. "Any witnesses?" Hobbs, a red-faced man with a nervous twitch, shuffled his papers. "Only that she collapsed suddenly, sir. No signs of a struggle, no obvious cause. The doctor says she might have fainted, but—" Purbright's eyes scanned the crowd, observing faces flushed with curiosity and barely disguised judgment. He noted Mrs. Penn, the owner of the local boarding house, looking distinctly uncomfortable, and Mr. Grimes, the tobacconist, whispering furiously into his wife's ear. "This flower show," Purbright began thoughtfully, "seems to have attracted more than the usual exhibitors today." Mrs. Tilling coughed primly. "Well, Inspector, in a town like Flaxborough, one is never entirely surprised to find a bit of novelty, or scandal." As the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the polished wooden tables and embroidered tablecloths, Purbright allowed the murmurs to settle and set about the delicate task of untangling a mystery that for the moment seemed at odds with the very idea of Flaxborough's polite routine. The peculiar case of the young woman in red was just beginning. The afternoon light filtered through the canvas, dappling the floor with patches of warmth that seemed at odds with the cool unease settling over the flower show. Inspector Purbright stood slightly apart from the gathering crowd, his hands folded neatly behind his back, watching as the murmurs grew into a low hum of speculation. The girl's lifeless form lay draped awkwardly near the refreshment stall, her red dress a stark splash of colour against the polished wood and delicate crockery. "Any name?" Purbright asked Hobbs quietly, his tone as even as the steady ticking of the old clock mounted near the marquee's entrance. "None on her, sir. No purse, no ID. Just this," the sergeant replied, producing a delicate silver locket, its chain tangled but otherwise unbroken. Purbright took it, weighing the small object thoughtfully. There was something faintly out of place about a young woman wearing such finery at an event known more for petunias than pearls. "Have we had any reports of missing persons?" Hobbs shook his head. "Not in the last week, though the local papers mentioned a Miss Evelyn Cartwright, new to town. No one's seen her much, apparently." He glanced around. She runs a boarding house, doesn't she? Yes, Purbright replied. Mrs. Pennsylvania, she seemed unsettled when I spoke to her briefly, quite unlike the usual genteel proprietress. As the inspector made his way towards the edge of the crowd, Mrs. Penn's eyes met his with a flicker of something, perhaps apprehension or something more guarded. "Inspector," she said, voice tight, "I hardly know what to say. Evelyn is a respectable woman. This girl, I don't believe she belonged here." "Do you know her?" Purbright asked gently. Mrs. Penn hesitated before nodding. "She's an acquaintance of sorts. I think she was staying with Evelyn for a short while. Quiet girl, kept to herself mostly, though I admit I didn't see much of her." Nearby, Mr. Grimes, the tobacconist, was engaged in a hushed conversation with his wife, glancing repeatedly at the red-dressed figure. Purbright observed the twitch in Mr. Grimes's jaw and the quickening of his breath. The tobacconist was known for his meticulous nature, a man who prized order above all else. The disruption unsettled him deeply. "Anything to add, Mr. Grimes?" Purbright's voice cut through the quiet. "Only that such disruption shouldn't be tolerated, sir," Grimes said stiffly. "This sort of thing gives Flaxborough a bad name. We are better than this." Purbright allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The town's reputation was always a delicate thing to balance, often outweighing the facts themselves. Turning back to the girl, Purbright noticed a slight smudge on the hem of her dress, something dark and faintly sticky. It was subtle, easy to miss amid the bright reds and lace. It piqued his interest more than he cared to admit. "Sergeant, have the medical examiner confirm cause of collapse. Meanwhile, I want inquiries made at the boarding houses and any local establishments she might have frequented." His gaze lingered briefly on the locket in his hand, before slipping it carefully into his coat pocket. As the crowd slowly dispersed, conversations began to resume their usual cadence, but beneath the surface, the quiet gears of gossip had started to turn. At the corner of the marquee, Mrs. Tilling gathered a small group, murmuring about impropriety and the dangers of letting strangers wander freely. Purbright observed all this with a detached patience. The puzzle was small now, but it would grow, layer upon layer, as the town revealed its secrets in the unlikeliest of places. And somewhere beneath the surface, the truth waited to be uncovered. The morning after the flower show arrived with the kind of gentle fog that seemed to soften the edges of Flaxborough, as if the town itself wished to blur the unsettling memory of the previous day. Inspector Purbright, however, preferred his view clear and unclouded, both literally and metaphorically. He found himself at the modest office of Dr. Cartwright, the local medical examiner, a man whose bedside manner was as blunt as his instruments. "Collapsed, did she?" Cartwright said, leafing through his notes as Purbright settled into the worn chair. "No external trauma, no signs of violence. Toxicology pending, but preliminary results suggest something, well, not natural." He looked up, expression thoughtful. "Something that didn't cause immediate death. More like a fainting spell with fatal consequences." Purbright nodded slowly. "And the identity?" "Miss Emily Harper," Cartwright replied. "A name that didn't ring any bells with the station, not in any records here." He tapped his pen. "Strange girl, apparently staying temporarily at the boarding house run by Mrs. Penn." The inspector tucked the locket into his pocket with deliberate care, the small silver heart glinting faintly. He recalled Mrs. Penn's uneasy glance yesterday, the way the woman seemed to skirt around certain questions. Flaxborough's boarding houses were little havens of quiet gossip and carefully concealed lives. Nothing about them was ever truly as it seemed. Later that morning, Purbright took his time walking the short distance to Mrs. Penn's establishment. A neat brick building with a well-kept front garden that belied the undercurrents of tension beneath. The proprietor met him at the door, her hands folded with practiced grace, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of apprehension. "Inspector," she began, voice measured, "I trust you understand this has been a distressing time for us all." "Of course, Mrs. Pennsylvania. I hope you don't mind a few questions about Miss Harper's stay." Mrs. Penn's lips pressed into a thin line. She was quiet, kept to herself mostly, paid in advance, which is always a little suspicious in a town like ours. Purbright noted the slight emphasis on suspicious and filed it away. "Did she have visitors?" "Only once, a Mr. Reynolds. A gentleman by all accounts, though not the sort we see often around here." "Did they seem close?" Mrs. Penn shook her head quickly. "Number." They spoke in hushed tones as though discussing something they wanted to keep private. The inspector's gaze softened. Sometimes it's what isn't said that tells us the most. As he turned to leave, a sudden noise in the street caught his attention. A sharp exchange between two men in the town square. Purbright's eyes narrowed slightly. This small town held many voices, and he intended to listen to them all. The investigation was beginning to unfold, the threads weaving a more complicated tapestry than anyone might have expected beneath the genteel surface of the flower show. And as always, Purbright's quiet patience would be the key to unravelling it all. The afternoon brought with it a trickle of unexpected visitors to Inspector Purbright's office, each bearing pieces of Flaxborough's carefully guarded tapestry of secrets. The first was Mr. Reynolds, a man whose neat attire and deliberate manners spoke of someone who wished to be seen but not closely examined. "Inspector," Reynolds began, settling into the stiff chair with practised ease. "Emily Harper was no trouble to me, but she did confide in me once or twice. She spoke of regrets, things left undone, chances missed. Nothing more, I assure you." Purbright noted the measured calm in Reynolds's voice, the slight tension beneath it. "Regrets can be powerful motives, Mr. Reynolds. Might I ask what specifically she regretted?" Reynolds hesitated, then replied, "Her past." She hinted at a life far removed from Flaxborough's quiet streets, a life she seemed desperate to escape. As the door closed behind Reynolds, Purbright turned to the next visitor, a Mrs. Gladys Pemberton, local librarian and a keen observer of human nature. "She was in here yesterday," Gladys whispered, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Asked for books on botany and history, an odd combination, don't you think? Almost as if she was trying to piece together something from the past." "Curious indeed," Purbright murmured, pen poised over his notebook. Later, as the evening settled with the soft glow of gas lamps, Purbright found himself walking through the town square. The murmur of gossip had thickened since the flower show, and faces once indifferent now bore shades of suspicion and curiosity. Near the old bakery, he overheard fragments of conversation, whispered accusations, veiled references to debts unpaid, and murmurs of a scandal long buried but never quite forgotten. Returning to his office, Purbright paused by the window, reflecting on the tangled web. The girl in red was more than a victim of a feint. She was a catalyst revealing the quiet fractures beneath Flaxborough's polite veneer. And he, as always, would listen carefully to the town's secrets, unravelling them one thread at a time. The morning sun spilled pale light across Flaxborough's cobbled streets, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch like whispers from the past. Inspector Purbright arrived early at the town council chambers, where a meeting was already underway, albeit one fraught with an unusual tension. The topic was the flower show incident, though no one dared utter it outright. Councillors shifted uneasily in their seats, exchanging glances and half-smiles, as if daring one another to speak first. Mr. Bexley cleared his throat, addressing the room with his usual mixture of self-importance and thinly veiled annoyance. It is unfortunate that such an event as our flower show should be marred by irregular occurrences. I trust the police are handling the matter with appropriate diligence. Councillor Marsh, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for pragmatism, nodded. Indeed. But I wonder if we might also consider the wider implications for the town's reputation. We cannot allow rumours to fester and damage our community's good name. Purbright observed quietly from the back, noting the subtle ways in which the assembled dignitaries sought to distance themselves from any unpleasantness. Yet beneath the polished words, he sensed something more, a reluctance to confront certain uncomfortable truths. Later, as the meeting adjourned, Purbright found himself speaking with Mrs. Tilling, who lamented the decline of proper standards and hinted at a need for greater vigilance. "I suppose, Inspector," she said primly, "there are those among us who would seek to exploit the kindness of Flaxborough for their own ends." "Perhaps," Purbright replied softly, "but sometimes it is kindness that reveals more than we expect." Back at the station, the sergeant handed him a small parcel, a carefully wrapped bundle containing a single, neatly folded letter. The handwriting was delicate, the ink faint, but legible. It read simply, "Some things are better left undisturbed. Beware the past you seek." Purbright folded the letter thoughtfully. The game, it seemed, was only just beginning. The evening drew its slow curtain over Flaxborough, the gas lamps flickering to life and casting a soft amber glow over the quiet streets. Inspector Purbright, seated in his modest office, examined the letter once more. The delicate script seemed almost too refined to be a mere warning. There was a precision to the wording, a certain elegance that suggested the writer was accustomed to veiling meaning behind civility. Outside, the murmur of the town carried on, a mixture of everyday routines and the whispered ripples stirred by recent events. The inspector poured himself a cup of tea, its warmth a small comfort amid the growing complexity of the case. His thoughts returned to Emily Harper, the girl in red who had arrived like an unwelcome bloom in the garden of Flaxborough's steady order. Her past, as hinted by Mr. Reynolds, was shrouded in shadows. Her presence here was no accident. Purbright reviewed the notes from Mrs. Pemberton, the librarian, who had mentioned Harper's interest in botany and history, a peculiar pairing that suggested a search for roots, or perhaps escape. Why those subjects, and why had the girl, seemingly so careful, brought herself to the flower show of all places? A knock interrupted his reverie. Sergeant Hobbs entered, carrying a small envelope. "The toxicology results, sir," he said, placing the envelope on the desk. Purbright opened it with measured care. The report confirmed the presence of a rare plant-based toxin, one not native to the region, and certainly not something one would expect to find in a simple flower show. His eyes narrowed thoughtfully. This was no accident, no feint from heat or fatigue. It was deliberate. Outside, a distant church bell tolled the hour, marking time as Flaxborough's quiet surface concealed more than anyone wished to admit. Purbright leaned back, steepling his fingers. The game was deepening, and the petals were beginning to fall away, revealing the thorns beneath. The following morning found Purbright at the edge of Flaxborough's modest market square, where a small crowd had gathered around a curious new development. A delivery van from a well-known exotic nursery had arrived overnight, its crates stacked neatly beside the town's Horticultural Society building. The driver, a young man with a sunburned face and hesitant smile, was fielding questions with practiced patience. Purbright approached quietly, noting the mixed expressions of curiosity and suspicion among the onlookers. Mrs. Tilling, who had arrived moments before, was already inspecting a crate with a critical eye. "I understand these plants are rare imports," she remarked, adjusting her hat with an air of mild disdain. "Unusual for Flaxborough, wouldn't you say?" "Indeed," Purbright replied, "especially given what we've recently learned about the toxin found in Miss Harper's system." He crouched to examine one of the crates, labels indicating species unfamiliar to local gardeners. One, in particular, caught his attention, a small, unassuming flower known for its beautiful yet deadly properties. As Mrs. Tilling looked on, Purbright's mind pieced together a subtle pattern. Emily Harper's interest in botany, the rare toxin, the presence at the flower show. Something about the import of these plants and the quiet dealings surrounding them suggested more than innocent horticultural enthusiasm. Later, at the town's tea rooms, whispers swirled among the patrons. Mr. Grimes spoke of outsiders bringing trouble. Mrs. Penn fretted over the safety of her guests, while Mr. Bexley speculated loudly on the potential impact to the town's reputation. Purbright listened. Attentively, his gaze steady and unassuming, the threads were converging, the small town's veneer of civility beginning to crack. Beneath polite conversation and floral displays, a far more tangled story was unfolding, and he intended to see it through petal by petal. As dusk settled over Flaxborough, casting long shadows through the narrow streets, Inspector Purbright found himself once again standing outside Mrs. Penn's boarding house. The quiet house, with its neatly tended garden and lace curtains, seemed at odds with the turmoil unfolding within its walls. Mrs. Penn met him at the door, her expression carefully composed, yet touched with fatigue. "Inspector, I fear the town's curiosity is becoming something else entirely." "I understand," Purbright said gently. "But I believe there are truths to uncover that may ease this unease." She hesitated, then led him into the sitting room, where the air held a faint scent of lavender and old paper. Emily was not as she seemed, Mrs. Penn admitted quietly. There were things she left unsaid, letters, phone calls late at night. She seemed frightened, though of what I never knew. Purbright listened carefully as she spoke, noting the subtle shifts in her tone, the moments where words faltered. "Did she mention anyone?" "Anyone who might wish her harm?" Mrs. Penn shook her head. "Only vague references. She was secretive but polite, always careful not to burden others." The inspector's eyes caught a small envelope resting on the mantelpiece, its seal unbroken. "May I?" With a reluctant nod, Mrs. Penn handed it over. Purbright broke the seal and unfolded a letter, its contents brief but charged with meaning. They watch. They wait. Trust no one. A chill settled over the room. The polite facade of Flaxborough was cracking further, and beneath it lurked something far less civil. Purbright pocketed the letter with quiet resolve. The shadows were lengthening, and the game was drawing ever closer to its hidden heart. The following morning, Inspector Purbright convened a discreet meeting at the town's modest police station, inviting those whose involvement or proximity had raised questions. The room was small, the air thick with unspoken tensions and carefully measured politeness. Mr. Reynolds arrived promptly, his expression courteous but guarded. Mrs. Penn followed, her usual composure edged with a subtle anxiety. Even Mrs. Tilling, whose social standing often kept her distant from such gatherings, appeared, clutching her handbag with a faint tremor. Purbright began gently, his voice calm and precise. "Thank you all for coming. I believe it is time we spoke frankly, if not fully, about the events surrounding Miss Harper's unfortunate death." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before continuing. "I have reason to believe that what seemed an unfortunate accident is far more complicated. There are forces at play, personal, perhaps even dangerous, that have brought us here. Eyes flicked nervously between the attendees. Reynolds cleared his throat. Inspector, I assure you, I wished only to help Miss Harper escape whatever troubles she carried. Mrs. Penn nodded in agreement. She was a good girl, trying to start anew. I regret I could not protect her. Mrs. Tilling, ever the guardian of propriety, adjusted her gloves. But we must remember our town's reputation. Such matters should be handled delicately. Purbright's gaze sharpened. Precisely why I must ask, who among us knows more than they admit? What secrets have been kept to preserve appearances? A long silence followed. Then, with a measured calm, Purbright posed the question he had long been crafting, a test disguised as a remark. Sometimes the truth is best revealed not in confrontation, but in the quiet moments when one believes themselves unobserved. The room seemed to hold its breath, and Purbright sensed the subtle shift, the flicker of unease beneath the composed masks. The game was reaching its crucial point. The late afternoon sun filtered through the Venetian blinds of Purbright's office, casting striped shadows over the polished wood of his desk. The inspector sat quietly, his fingers steepled as he contemplated the puzzle that had taken root in Flaxborough's genteel heart. A soft knock announced Sergeant Hobbs, who entered with a sheaf of papers. "Sir, I've compiled the witness statements and the background checks on our principal suspects." Purbright gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Thank you, Hobbs. Let's review them." As they went through the reports, a pattern began to emerge. Small contradictions, overlooked details, subtle shifts in tone. Mr. Reynolds's account was impeccable, but lacked warmth. Mrs. Penn's recollections were tinged with guilt. Mrs. Tilling's insistence on propriety seemed to mask deeper anxieties. But it was the little things that caught Purbright's eye: a misplaced key found in the boarding-house garden, the faint scent of the exotic toxin lingering in a vase, a hastily discarded glove near the flower show marquee. Purbright leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "It is not always what is said, Hobbs, but what is left unsaid. The truth often hides in the silence between words." Later that evening, Purbright arranged a quiet gathering at the Horticultural Society Hall, inviting those involved under the pretense of a small social occasion. The room, filled with floral arrangements and muted conversation, seemed an unlikely setting for revelation. With gentle precision, Purbright steered the conversation, his questions polite but probing. He noticed the subtle exchange of glances, the quickening of breath, the slight tremor in a hand. At last he paused before Mrs. Pennsylvania. "Your kindness to Miss Harper was evident, yet it appears someone wished to ensure her silence. Perhaps you might shed light on who would benefit most from her absence." The room held its collective breath as Purbright's quiet inquiry unsettled the carefully constructed calm. The threads were drawing taut, ready to snap. The room in the Horticultural Society Hall had settled into a hushed expectancy, the soft rustle of silk and the faint fragrance of lilies forming an unlikely backdrop for the unfolding drama. Inspector Purbright stood calmly, his gaze sweeping the assembled faces, each carefully guarded, yet betraying the faintest tremors beneath their composed exteriors. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice measured and unhurried, "the mystery of Miss Emily Harper's death has occupied us all these past days. What began as an unfortunate collapse at our flower show was, in fact, a deliberate act, one woven into the fabric of our town's less visible stories." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. Miss Harper came to Flaxborough seeking a fresh start, carrying with her a past she wished to leave behind. Her interest in rare plants and history was no mere curiosity. It was a search for answers, or perhaps a way to conceal herself, yet her presence disturbed certain delicate balances. Turning to Mrs. Penn, Purbright's eyes held a quiet intensity. You provided her shelter, and in doing so became a silent witness to her fears. The letters she received, the late-night calls, these were threads connecting her to someone who did not wish for her to remain free. He shifted his gaze to Mr. Reynolds. You came to her aid, but your involvement was more complicated than you admitted. Your past, like hers, contained shadows you sought to escape. The room's tension thickened as Purbright continued. The rare toxin found in Miss Harper's system is derived from a plant introduced to our town through seemingly innocent horticultural imports. This toxin was no accident. It was a carefully administered poison designed to silence. His voice softened as he addressed the assembled guests. But the question remains, who had the means, motive, and opportunity? A faint breath escaped Mrs. Tilling as Purbright's gaze fixed upon her. Your dedication to Flaxborough's reputation is well known, yet your insistence on propriety masked a determination to protect the town from scandal at any cost. When Miss Harper threatened to reveal a long-buried secret, one that would have unsettled the very foundations of this community, you chose to act. Mrs. Tilling's composure faltered for a fleeting moment before she nodded slowly, eyes downcast. Purbright turned away briefly before concluding with a quiet smile. Justice need not always shout. Sometimes it whispers through the careful unraveling of truths and the patient listening to what is left unsaid. The gathering exhaled collectively, the tension easing as the final pieces settled into place. As Flaxborough resumed its gentle rhythm, the town's surface restored but forever marked by the quiet revelations beneath, Inspector Purbright returned to his office. There, amid his quiet paperwork and measured thoughts, he contemplated the delicate balance of human nature and the small town secrets that, like the rarest flowers, often concealed the sharpest thorns.